My truck broke down twice on the way to my daughter's housewarming party. When I finally arrived, I stood outside the door holding the handmade gift I spent weeks creating. Then I heard my daughter's voice through the window. Honestly, I wish my dad hadn't come. He's so old-fashioned. He'll only ruin the atmosphere. I froze. The home I helped pay for the dream I built for her suddenly felt like a place where I didn't belong. But what I discovered next changed everything. I'm grateful you're here. Before I continue, tell me in the comments, what country or city are you joining us from today? It means the world to know who's listening. You're part of the Dad Family Revenge family now. Please note some elements of this story are fictional, shaped for entertainment and education. Similarities to any names or locations are purely coincidental, but the message underneath is one worth carrying. My truck broke down twice on the way there. The second time, I had to wait on the shoulder of the Colorado Boulevard for nearly 40 minutes before the engine finally turned over again. By the time I pulled onto their street in Pasadena, the housewarming party had already been going for more than an hour. I parked 2 houses down because every spot closer was taken. Nice cars, newer models, the kind of vehicles I'd never owned and never thought much about until moments like this, when the difference became impossible to ignore. I reached into the back seat and picked up the gift I'd brought. Not something I bought, something I made. A wooden picture frame I'd built in my garage over 3 weekends, sanded, smooth, stained, dark walnut. Inside it, a photograph Claire at 8 years old standing between me and her mother at one of my job sites downtown. She was wearing my hard hat, grinning so wide her eyes had nearly disappeared. Maggie stood beside her laughing at something I'd said. I couldn't remember what. I wished I could. I walked toward the house along the side path, the way I always used to come in when I'd visit them at their old place. The front door was crowded with guests spilling out onto the porch, so the side entrance felt easier. Less fuss. That's when I heard Claire's voice through the kitchen window. It was open just a few inches, enough to let the warm April air circulate enough to let sound travel. I stopped walking. Honestly, I told him the party started at 4, Claire was saying. Her voice was easy, relaxed, the voice she used when she was performing for company. He'll probably show up late anyway. His truck is always breaking down. A woman laughed, someone I didn't recognize. Oh, that's too bad. He must be so excited to see the place. He is. A pause. That's kind of the problem. The woman's voice dropped, curious. What do you mean, Dad doesn't really fit, you know, Claire said. He means well. He always means well. But he shows up in his old work clothes, starts talking about the materials they used to build the walls, tells everyone stories about job sites from 20 years ago. It reminds people that we needed help getting here, that we couldn't do this on our own. My chest tightened. My fingers pressed harder around the picture frame. He paid for a big chunk of this place, didn't he? The woman asked. He helped, Claire said, her voice cooling slightly. But that doesn't mean he needs to be the center of every conversation. Daniel and I worked hard for this. I just want people to see that. Is that terrible? No, the woman said quietly. I understand. I stood there on the side path, while the sounds of the party continued around the corner. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses. My legs felt like they'd been filled with wet concrete. The picture frame in my hands, the one I'd spent 3 weekends building, suddenly felt heavier than anything I'd carried on a job site in 40 years. I thought about Maggie, about the way she used to squeeze my hand when I felt out of place somewhere. She always knew. She always found me in a crowd and squeezed my hand once, just once, and that was enough. She wasn't here to squeeze my hand tonight. I looked down at the photograph behind the glass. Claire, at 8 years old, wearing my hard hat, grinning like the world was a place built just for her. I walked to the front porch. There was a wooden bench near the door, the kind meant for taking off shoes or sitting with a cup of coffee in the morning. I set the picture frame down on it, leaning it gently against the wall so it wouldn't fall. Then I turned around and walked back to my truck. Nobody saw me arrive. Nobody saw me leave. I drove home through the evening traffic with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and somewhere on the 2 freeway heading back toward Glendale. My eyes started burning in a way I hadn't felt in a very long time. I didn't cry. I was too tired to cry. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking the entire way home. The bungalow on Merton Avenue had never felt small to me before that night. I'd lived there for 31 years, raised Claire in that house, brought Maggie home from the hospital there after her first surgery, helped her up the porch steps when she was too weak to manage them alone. I'd repainted the kitchen 3 times because Maggie kept changing her mind about the color, and every time she'd stood back and said, "Yes, that's it. That's exactly it." And I'd believed her every single time. But that Saturday night, when I pushed open the front door and stepped into the hallway, the house felt like it was holding its breath. I hung my keys on the hook by the door, the same hook I'd installed in 1994, and walked into the living room. Maggie's photograph sat on the side table where it always had in the silver frame Claire had given us for our 30th anniversary. Maggie was laughing in the picture, caught mid-sentence at somebody's backyard barbecue, her dark hair lifting slightly in the wind. She looked like she was about to say something important. I sat down in the armchair across from her and pressed both hands flat against my knees to stop them from shaking. "Well," I said out loud. That was something. I don't know why I still talked to her photograph. I'd started doing it about a year after she passed. When the quiet in the house got so heavy, I thought it might actually crush me. My buddy James had suggested it said his own father used to talk to his mother's picture every morning while he drank his coffee. "It sounds crazy," James had told me. "But grief doesn't care what sounds crazy." I looked at Maggie's face and thought about what I'd heard through that kitchen window. He shows up in his old work clothes. He reminds people that we needed help. I closed my eyes. Behind them, a different memory surfaced, not from tonight, but from 2 years ago. The afternoon, I sat across from Claire and Daniel at their kitchen table and slid a cashier's check across the surface toward them. $280,000. Every cent of it pulled from the retirement account I'd been building since 1987, $20 at a time in the early years, more when the union contracts got better. Daniel had picked up the check and looked at it for a long moment. Then he'd looked at me and said, "Robert, we're going to take such good care of this. I promise you." Claire had reached across the table and grabbed both my hands in hers. Her eyes were wet. "Dad," she'd said, and her voice had broken on that single word in a way that made my own throat tighten. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to thank you." "No, you don't have to thank me," I'd told her. "Just send me the final paperwork when everything's done. I want to make sure all the names are right." Daniel had nodded right away. "Of course. We'll send it over as soon as the notary finishes the corrections. Probably within the week." That week came and went. Then another. I brought it up once, maybe 6 weeks later, and Claire had said they were still waiting on one document from the title company. I hadn't pushed. She was my daughter. I trusted her the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, without thinking about it, because the alternative is too exhausting to consider. I opened my eyes and looked at Maggie's photograph again. "I should have pushed," I said. The house didn't answer. Outside, a car rolled slowly past the window, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. I got up and walked down the hall to Claire's old bedroom. I'd never converted it into anything, never made it a home office or a storage room the way people do. The twin bed was still there with the same blue comforter. The poster of some band she'd loved at 16 was still tacked to the wall, its corners curling. A stuffed bear sat on the top shelf of the bookcase next to her high school graduation photo. In the picture, she was beaming her diploma pressed against her chest with both hands, and I was standing beside her in a shirt I'd ironed 3 times that morning because I wanted to look right for her day. My chest hurt looking at it. I reached up and touched the frame lightly with one finger. Then I walked back to the living room, picked up my phone from the coffee table, and sat back down in the armchair. Tomorrow morning, I decided I would call Claire tomorrow morning and ask calmly just once more to see the final deed. Not to cause trouble, not to start a fight. Just to confirm that what Daniel had promised 2 years ago had actually been done. It was a reasonable thing to ask. It was the kind of thing any man in my position would ask. I set the phone down and looked at Maggie's photograph one last time before I turned off the lamp. "I'm probably worried about nothing," I told her, but my hands still hadn't stopped shaking. And somewhere in the part of me that had spent 40 years reading job sites, learning to spot the cracks before the wall came down, something quiet and cold had already begun to stir. I was up before 6. I hadn't slept well, kept waking up in the dark, with that cold, quiet feeling sitting on my chest, like something I couldn't name. By 5:30, I gave up entirely, got out of bed, and stood at the kitchen counter watching the coffee drip into the pot, while the neighborhood outside was still gray and still. I waited until 8 o'clock to call. I didn't want to seem frantic. I didn't want Claire to hear anything in my voice that would put her on the defensive before I'd even said what I needed to say. So I waited, drank 2 cups of coffee, rinsed the mug, dried it, put it back in the cabinet. Then I picked up the phone. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad." Her voice was warm, slightly surprised. "Hey, you missed a great party last night. Where did you end up?" The question hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. She didn't know I'd been there. She didn't know I'd stood 20 feet from her kitchen window and heard every word she'd said about me to her guests. And in that moment, I made a decision I wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. "Truck gave me trouble again," I said. By the time I got it sorted out, I figured the evening was already winding down. "Oh, Dad." She made a soft sound, half sympathy, half something else I couldn't quite identify. "You really need to get that thing looked at." "I know. Listen, Claire. I actually called because I wanted to follow up on something. The final deed for the house. Daniel mentioned he'd send it over after the notary finished, and I just realized I never received it. I want to make sure everything's recorded correctly. My name, your name, the contribution amount, all of it." A pause. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. But I had spent 40 years reading silences on job sites, the pause before a foreman tells you the schedule has changed. The quiet before someone admits the foundation measurements are off. 2 seconds was enough. "Why?" Claire asked. Her voice hadn't changed in tone exactly, but something underneath it had shifted. The warmth was still there on the surface, but below it was something careful. "Measured. Because it's a $280,000 transaction," I said, keeping my voice even. "And I never saw the final version. That's just good practice, Claire. I'm not accusing anyone of anything." "I know you're not accusing anyone, Dad." Now there was a faint edge in her voice, thin as a wire. I don't understand why you're bringing this up the morning after our housewarming. We just celebrated. Can't we just enjoy this for a moment?" My grip tightened on the phone. I pressed my back molars together once hard, then made myself relax my jaw. "I am enjoying it," I said. "I'm proud of you. I'm proud of what you and Daniel have built. This is just a paperwork question. It should take 5 minutes." Daniel handles all the paperwork, she said. You know I'm not good with that stuff. I'll have him call you. You said that before, I told her. About 2 months ago when I asked the first time. He didn't call. Another pause. Longer this time. Dad. Her voice had dropped. Are you saying you don't trust us? The question landed like a hand pressed flat against my sternum. Because the honest answer, the answer I'd been trying not to look at directly since the night before, was that I didn't know anymore. And not knowing felt like standing on a floor I'd always assumed was solid and feeling it shift just slightly beneath my feet. I'm saying I'd like to see the paperwork, I said carefully. That's all. Fine. The warmth was gone now entirely. I'll talk to Daniel. But I want you to know this feels like you're making something out of nothing, and it hurts that you can't just let us have this. Before I could respond, she added, I have to go. We're still cleaning up from last night. The line went quiet. She'd ended the call. I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone in my hand and stared at the wall in front of me. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. My mouth had gone dry. In 40 years of construction work, I dealt with subcontractors who stalled suppliers, who deflected project managers, who changed the subject when the numbers didn't add up. I knew what it looked like when someone was buying time. I set the phone down on the counter. Daniel never called that day, or the next. By Tuesday morning, 3 days after the housewarming, I had stopped expecting him to. What I hadn't expected, what nothing in 40 years had prepared me for, was the sound of someone knocking on my front door at 7:45 in the morning, with the kind of knock that doesn't wait to be invited in. I set my coffee mug down on the counter and walked to the front door. 2 people stood on my porch. A woman and a man, both in plain clothes, both with the particular stillness of people who had delivered difficult news before and had learned not to rush it. The woman held up a badge and a leather wallet, gold shield, LAPD insignia. Mr. Robert Hayes, she said. That's me. I'm Detective Yvonne Reyes, Los Angeles Police Department, Northeast Division. She gestured briefly to the man beside her. This is my partner, Detective Salazar. Mr. Hayes, we'd like to speak with you about a complaint that's been filed regarding a real estate transaction. May we come in? My hand tightened on the doorframe. Not because I was afraid, not yet, but because something in my chest had just lurched sideways in a way I didn't fully understand. What kind of complaint? I asked. Detective Reyes met my eyes steadily. Sir, the complaint alleges that you altered legal documents connected to a residential property purchase in Pasadena, specifically a deed modification and supporting filings. She paused. The complainant is your daughter, Claire Morton. The words landed one at a time like stones dropped into still water. My daughter. Claire. I became aware distantly that my grip on the doorframe had tightened to the point where my knuckles had gone white. I made myself let go, made myself breathe. You'd better come in, I said. They came in. Salazar moved to the side wall and opened a small notepad, the quiet partner, the one who wrote everything down while Reyes did the talking. They sat on the couch. I sat in the armchair, Maggie's armchair, the one I'd been sitting in 2 nights ago, talking to her photograph. Detective Reyes set a manila folder on the coffee table between us, but didn't open it yet. Mr. Hayes. She began, her voice measured and professional. I want to be clear about what this conversation is. You are not under arrest. You are not being charged with anything at this time. We are here to inform you that a formal complaint has been submitted and an investigation has been opened. What exactly am I supposed to have done? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Reyes opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents I didn't immediately recognize. She turned them to face me and slid them across the table. The complaint alleges that you forged signatures on a deed modification that's a violation of California Penal Code Section 470, and that you filed false documents with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office, which falls under California Penal Code Section 115. She tapped the top page. The allegation is that you altered the ownership records of the Pasadena property after the transaction was complete, in an attempt to retain financial control over an asset that had been transferred to your daughter and son-in-law. I stared at the documents. There on the third page was a signature. My name, Robert Hayes, written in the looping, slightly right-leaning hand I'd used my entire adult life. Except I had never signed that document. I had never seen that document. "That's not my signature," I said. "Sir, I understand what you're telling me." I pressed my palm flat against my thigh to stop my leg from shaking. "And I'm telling you, I have never seen this document before in my life. Whatever that is, I did not sign it." Rhea studied me for a moment, with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had heard that statement before and had learned not to assign it weight in either direction. "Mr. Hayes, at this stage, we're simply gathering information. I'd strongly encourage you to retain legal counsel before making any further statements." "My own daughter filed this complaint," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth. Foreign. Like I was reading from a script written for someone else's life. "Claire filed this." "That's correct." I looked at Maggie's photograph on the side table. Her face caught the morning light coming through the window, that same laughing expression frozen mid-sentence like she was always just about to say something. Outside, I heard a sound. I glanced toward the window. Across the street, my neighbor of 40 years, Eleanor Patterson, had stepped onto her porch with her morning coffee. She was looking at the two unmarked cars parked in front of my house with an expression I had never seen her direct at me before. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and went back inside without waving. Something in my stomach dropped. Detective Reyes slid a single sheet across the table. "Mr. Hayes, this is a notice requiring you to remain available for further questioning. You are not to leave Los Angeles County without notifying this office. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. She stood. Her partner stood. I walked them to the door and watched them descend the porch steps and get into their vehicles. Reyes glanced back once before she opened her car door, not unkindly, just assessing, and then she was gone. I stood on the porch in my house slippers, holding the notice in one hand. The document with my forged signature was still on the coffee table inside. I went back and picked it up, held it under the lamp by the window. The signature looked exactly like mine. The slope of the letters, the way the H in Hayes extended slightly below the baseline, all of it. But my hand had not written it. I reached for my phone. There was only one call I needed to make. James Carter had spent 30 years finding exactly this kind of thing, the thing that looked real but wasn't. I didn't even finish dialing before my thumb was already pressing his name. He answered before the second ring. "Robert." His voice was alert even at this hour. "Talk to me, James," I said, and my voice cracked on his name in a way I hadn't expected. "I need you to come over. Right now. Something has happened and I can't." "I'm already getting my keys," James said. "Don't touch anything. Don't call anyone else. I'll be there in 45 minutes. I sat back down in the armchair and held the forged document in both hands and waited. Through the window, the morning light on Merton Avenue looked exactly the same as it always had. Quiet, ordinary, unchanged. Everything else had just fallen apart. James Carter hadn't changed much in 38 years. He was heavier now, and his hair had gone fully white sometime in his early 60s. But he still walked the same way he always had, like a man who had somewhere specific to be and intended to get there without wasting a single step. He came through my front door, set his jacket over the back of a chair, and picked up the forged document from the coffee table before he'd even sat down. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just read. I stood by the kitchen doorway and watched him. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago. I hadn't bothered making more. After about 3 minutes, James set the document down and looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So I did. I told him about the $280,000, about the draft deed that had my name on it, about Daniel's promise to send the final version, about the housewarming and what I'd heard through the kitchen window and Claire's voice on the phone 2 days later, going cool and careful the moment I mentioned paperwork. James listened without interrupting, once his hands folded in his lap, his eyes on my face. When I finished, he picked up the document again. "Come here," he said. "Look at this with me." I sat down on the couch beside him. He held the page under the lamp and pointed to my signature at the bottom. "What do you notice about the letter R?" he asked. I looked. "It looks like my R." "It does," James agreed. "Almost perfectly. But look at the angle here where the leg of the R kicks out at the bottom." He traced it with his fingertip without touching the paper. "Your natural signature, the one I've seen you write 100 times on job site paperwork and birthday cards and Christmas checks, your R kicks out at about 30 degrees. This one is closer to 22. It's subtle. You'd never catch it just glancing at it. But it's there." My stomach turned over slowly. "Someone scanned one of my real signatures," I said. "That's my read," James said. "They took a high-resolution scan of your actual signature, probably from one of the original draft documents you signed, and then digitally adjusted it. Repositioned it on this page. Changed the angle slightly in the process, which is how these things always give themselves away." He set the paper down and looked at me directly. "Robert, this is called digital signature forgery. It requires someone with access to your original documents and enough technical skill to work with image files. This wasn't a stranger. The room felt like it had gotten smaller. Daniel is an architect," I said. "He works with digital files every day. Blueprints design software document management systems." "I know," James said. "And Claire would have had access to the original draft. I signed it at their kitchen table. I left my copy there because Daniel said he'd keep everything together in one file." James nodded slowly. "Robert, I need you to think carefully. Do you have any record of that original draft, emails, text messages, anything where Daniel or Claire acknowledged that your name was supposed to be on the final deed?" I reached for my phone. My hands were steadier now, not because the fear had left, but because having James beside me had converted the fear into something I could actually use. I opened my messages and scrolled back through months of texts from Claire. Then I found it. A message from 14 months ago. Claire's number. The text read, "Dad, Daniel says the title company needs 1 more week to finalize everything. Your name will be on there, I promise. Thank you again for everything. We love you." I held the phone out to James. He read it once. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time since he'd walked through my door, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like the look of a man who has just found the loose thread that unravels everything. "We're going to need a lawyer," he said. "Not tomorrow. Today. Sandra Cole's office was on the 12th floor of a building on South Flower Street in downtown Los Angeles, and the view from her window was the kind that reminded you the city was enormous and indifferent and had seen everything before. She was already behind her desk when James and I came in, a compact woman in her early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of eyes that assessed a situation the way a contractor assessed a building, quickly, thoroughly, and without sentiment. She shook my hand first, then James's, and gestured to the two chairs across from her. "James tells me you've had a difficult few days," she said, settling back into her chair. "Walk me through it. All of it. I'll stop you if I need clarification." I talked for 20 minutes. Sandra didn't write anything down while I spoke. She just watched me. Her fingers laced together on the desk, occasionally tilting her head slightly when I mentioned a specific date or figure. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. Then she said, "Mr. Hayes, I've been practicing elder law and real estate fraud litigation for 20 years. What you've just described has a name. It's called a predatory transfer scheme, and the criminal complaint your daughter filed against you is not incidental to it. It's the centerpiece." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean the accusation came first because it had to." Sandra unfolded her hands and picked up a pen, tapping it once against her notepad. "If they accuse you of fraud before you can raise questions about the deed, they accomplish 2 things simultaneously. First, they damage your credibility. Suddenly, you're the person under investigation, not them. Second, they put you on the defensive financially. Criminal investigations are expensive to respond to. Most people in your position spend everything they have just trying to clear their name, and by the time it's over, they have nothing left to pursue a civil claim." My jaw tightened. "They thought I'd just give up." "They counted on it," Sandra said flatly. "Now, the $280,000. She opened the folder James had handed her when we sat down, copies of my bank wire records, the draft deed, and the screenshot of Claire's text message. She studied the text message for a long moment. "This is significant." "Can I get the money back?" I asked. Even without my name on the deed, Sandra set the folder down and looked at me directly. "Under normal circumstances, when someone contributes funds to a property purchase without being listed on the title, the law can treat that contribution as a gift, meaning you gave it voluntarily and have no legal claim to it." She paused. "But there is a legal doctrine called constructive trust. It allows a court to look past the paperwork and ask a more fundamental question: who actually provided the money, and was that person deceived into providing it? If the answer is yes, if the court finds that you were misled into believing your name would be on the deed, then the court can order the people holding the property to return your contribution, regardless of what the title currently says." I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. "So the text message from Claire is evidence that you were promised inclusion on the title," Sandra said. "Combined with your wire transfer records, showing the source of funds and the draft deed with your name on it, we have the foundation of a constructive trust argument." She paused. "It's not a guarantee, but it's far from nothing." James shifted in his chair beside me. "Sandra, what about the forgery angle? Can we counter-file?" "We can and we will." She turned to a fresh page on her notepad. "California Penal Code Section 470 Forgery. California Penal Code Section 115 Filing False Documents, and depending on what we find in the digital evidence, potentially. Wire fraud under federal statute, Title 18, Section 1343, which covers fraudulent schemes conducted through electronic communications." She looked at me. Mr. Hayes, do you know if Daniel Morton used email or text messages to coordinate any part of this with the notary or title company? I don't know what he sent, I said. But he's an architect. He does everything digitally. Then we subpoena the records. Sandra clicked her pen closed. I'm going to be direct with you. This is going to be difficult. It will take time. And at some point, you will want to call your daughter and try to reason with her, and I'm asking you right now, before that impulse strikes, don't. Not yet. Every conversation you have with Claire or Daniel without counsel present is a conversation that can be used against you. I nodded. My throat felt tight. One more thing. Sandra slid a single sheet across the desk toward me. I want you to look at your phone right now and check your bank account. I didn't understand why, but I unlocked my phone and opened the app. The screen loaded. I stared at it. Then my stomach dropped straight through the floor. Sandra, I said, and my voice had gone very quiet. My account says restricted. Sandra's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. When did that happen? I checked it yesterday and it was fine. My hand tightened around the phone until the edges dug into my palm. What does this mean? Sandra was already reaching for her own phone. It means they moved faster than I expected, she said. And it means we move faster too. Sandra filed the emergency paperwork that afternoon. She told me it would take until at least Monday for the court to review the motion to dissolve the account freeze, something called a writ of attachment that Claire had apparently obtained through Los Angeles Superior Court by arguing I owed her money related to the property dispute. The process was legitimate. The claim behind it was not. But the law didn't know that yet, and until it did, the $270 in my wallet was all I had access to. I drove home from Sandra's office in the kind of focused, deliberate silence of a man who knows that if he lets himself feel the full weight of what is happening, he will not be able to drive. I pulled onto Merton Avenue just after 4 in the afternoon. Eleanor Patterson was standing at the edge of her front yard, near the low fence that separated our properties. She was wearing her gardening gloves, but she wasn't gardening. She was watching me pull into my driveway with an expression I had spent 40 years believing I would never see on her face. I got out of the truck, and she walked toward the fence. "Robert," she said. Her voice was careful, positioned, the voice of someone who has rehearsed an opening line. "I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll be honest with me." "Eleanor." I said, "I've been honest with you for 40 years. She pulled one glove off and folded it in her hands. "Daniel called me last night. He said you've been trying to take the house back, that you gave them money as a gift, and now you're claiming it was a loan, and that you've been threatening them with legal action to force them out." My chest felt like something inside it had just been wrung out like a wet cloth. "Eleanor," I said slowly, "did Daniel tell you that Claire filed a criminal complaint against me, that there are detectives investigating me for forgery?" She blinked. "He said you were making things up to deflect from what you did." "I see." I pressed my hand flat against the top of the fence post to steady myself. "Eleanor, I've got grass stains on my work gloves from planting those rose bushes along your south fence 8 years ago, because your husband's back was giving him trouble. I painted your garage door in 2019 because you asked me to, and I didn't charge you a cent. Has anything I've ever done given you a reason to think I'm the kind of man who would steal from his own daughter?" Her expression flickered. Something moved behind her eyes, not quite doubt, but the beginning of it. "I don't know what to think," she said quietly. "I know," I said. "That's exactly what he's counting on." I walked to my front door. My hand was shaking so badly I missed the keyhole twice before I got inside. The note was already there. Someone had slid it under my door while I was out, a folded piece of paper, no envelope. I picked it up and opened it. 4 words printed in block letters from someone who hadn't signed their name. "Give it back, Robert." I stood in my hallway holding that note and felt something move through me that I hadn't felt since the week after Maggie died. Not grief exactly, not anger. Something deeper and more corrosive than either. The feeling of being entirely alone inside a life you built with your own hands. I set the note on the kitchen table and called James. He answered on the first ring. "I heard," he said before I could speak. "Tom Briggs called me an hour ago. Daniel got to him too." Tom Briggs. We'd worked together on a job site in Burbank in 1998, poured foundations side by side for 11 months, eaten lunch off the same tailgate for the better part of a year. He was one of the people I'd called when Maggie passed. He'd driven 2 hours in traffic to be at the service. "What did Tom say?" I asked, though some part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. "He said he's not sure what to believe," James said. "Robert Daniel has been working the phones. He's contacted at least 6 people that I know of. He's telling everyone the same story, that you gave Claire the money as a gift, and now you're trying to extort them to get it back." I sat down at the kitchen table. The note was still in front of me. My coffee from this morning was still on the counter, stone cold, untouched. "He's trying to make sure no one will believe me," I said. "Yes," James said. "Which means he's scared. People who are winning don't burn their bridges. They burn bridges when they're trying to cut off a retreat." A pause. "Robert, I need you to check your bank account one more time. Sandra thinks the freeze covers everything, checking savings the whole picture." I opened the app with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. Both accounts. Restricted. The small emergency fund I kept in a separate savings account, the one I'd never touched. The one I'd always told myself was for true disasters. Restricted. $270 in my wallet and a kitchen full of groceries I hoped would last the week. "James," I said, and my voice came out lower than I intended, scraped thin at the edges. "I need this to move faster." "I know," he said. "And it will. But Robert, listen to me carefully. Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting with someone, an old contact from my investigation days. She works at a notary office in Pasadena, and she called me tonight out of the blue." He paused. "She says she needs to talk to us about the Morton file." I pressed the phone harder against my ear. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the April light was fading over the rooftops of Glendale. "Who is she?" I asked. "Her name is Amy Vargas," James said. "And I think she's been waiting for someone to ask her the right questions for a long time." I didn't sleep that night. Not for lack of trying. I lay on top of the covers with my boots still on until sometime after midnight, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around me the way old houses do, creaking and sighing as if the wood itself was exhausted. At some point I got up, walked to the kitchen, and stood at the counter in the dark for a long time without turning on the light. The note was still on the table. "Give it back, Robert." 4 words from someone who didn't have the courage to sign their name. I'd folded it and put it in my shirt pocket earlier because Sandra had said to keep everything, every piece of paper, every message, every scrap that might become evidence. I could feel it there against my chest light, as a feather heavy as a brick. I opened the refrigerator. Eggs. Half a block of cheddar. A loaf of bread that had 2 more days before it turned. A container of leftover chili I'd made on Sunday, before any of this had happened, back when Sunday was just Sunday and not the last ordinary day of my life. $270 in my wallet. Both bank accounts frozen by a court order my own daughter had applied for. I'd spent 38 years contributing to union pension funds, setting aside money in retirement accounts, building something slow and careful and honest out of nothing but time and labor. And in the space of 1 week, I couldn't buy groceries without counting the bills first. I closed the refrigerator and walked into the living room. Maggie's photograph caught the faint light from the street lamp outside. I sat down in the armchair across from her and leaned forward with my elbows on my knees and my face in my hands. "I don't know what I did wrong," I said into my palms. The words surprised me. I hadn't planned to say them. But once they were out, I understood they were the thing I'd been carrying since Saturday evening. Since I'd stood outside that kitchen window and heard my daughter's voice describing me like I was an inconvenience she hadn't figured out how to return. I lifted my face from my hands and looked at Maggie's photograph. "I kept every promise I made to you," I said. "I showed up. I didn't complain. I wrote the check without asking for anything back because I thought that was what a father was supposed to do." My voice cracked at the seam between those last two words, and I let it. There was no one here to hold it together for. I thought that was what love looked like. Outside, a car passed slowly on Merton Avenue, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling like a hand waving goodbye. I thought about Claire at 8 years old wearing my hard hat. I thought about her at 22 calling me from her first apartment to say the faucet was leaking and she didn't know how to fix it, and I'd driven 40 minutes across the city on a Tuesday night to fix it for her, and then taken her out for tacos afterward because she'd sounded lonely. I thought about the way she'd cried at her mother's graveside and reached for my hand without looking, just reached out sideways and found it, and I'd held on until she was ready to let go. I had been her father for 38 years. I had never once let go before she was ready. But somewhere along the way, without my noticing, she had let go of me. I got up from the armchair and walked down the hall to Claire's old bedroom. The stuffed bear on the shelf, the curling poster, the graduation photograph where I was standing beside her in the shirt I'd ironed 3 times. I took the graduation photograph off the shelf and carried it back to the living room and set it beside Maggie's picture on the side table. Then I sat back down. 2 photographs. 2 people I had built my entire life around. One of them was gone, and one of them had filed a criminal complaint against me. I sat with that for a long time. At some point, near 3 in the morning, something shifted inside me. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too bright for 3 in the morning in a dark living room with a frozen bank account and a note in my shirt pocket. What shifted was something quieter, older. The thing that had gotten me through 40 years of dawn starts and winter pours, and jobs that went wrong, and clients who didn't pay, and the long grinding work of building something out of nothing. Stubbornness, maybe. Or something that stubbornness grew into when it had enough years on it. I was not going to give this to them. Not the money. Not my name. Not the 40 years of reputation that Eleanor Patterson was already beginning to question, and Tom Briggs had apparently set aside. None of it. I had built every one of those things with my own hands, and I was not going to let Daniel Morton and my daughter dismantle them without a fight. I picked up my phone from the coffee table. 5:47 in the morning. Too early to call Sandra. Too early to call James. I went to the kitchen, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat down at the table with a legal pad James had left behind the night before. At the top of the first page, I wrote everything I know in order. Start with the draft deed, and I started writing. By the time the sun came up over the rooftops of Glendale, I had 4 pages. My hand ached. My coffee had gone cold twice. And when my phone rang at 7:30 and James's name appeared on the screen, I answered it with something in my chest that felt cautiously like the beginning of solid ground. "Robert," James said, "we're meeting Amy Vargas tonight. Sandra wants us all in her office first at 9. Can you be there? I looked at the 4 pages in front of me, at Maggie's photograph on the side table in the living room, at the graduation picture beside it. I'll be there at 8:30, I said. Sandra was already on her second cup of coffee when James and I walked in at 8:55. She had the 4 pages I'd written through the night spread across her desk, beside a yellow legal pad of her own covered in handwriting I couldn't read from where I stood. She'd called James at 7 that morning, after he'd texted her a summary of what Amy Vargas had said. By the time we sat down, Sandra had already drafted the emergency motion. "Good morning," she said, looking at me over the rim of her mug. "You look terrible." "I feel worse," I said. "Good. That means you're taking this seriously." She set her mug down and picked up a stack of papers. "Let's go through what we're doing today and why." She laid the first document in front of me. "This is the emergency motion to dissolve the writ of attachment on your accounts. Under California Code of Civil Procedure, Section 483.10, a writ of attachment can only be sustained if the underlying claim is valid. Claire's claim is that you owe her money related to the property dispute." Sandra tapped the page. "But we have wire transfer records showing you were the one who provided the funds, not the other way around. We have her text message confirming your name was supposed to be on the deed. And we have James's preliminary analysis showing the signature on the disputed document is inconsistent with your natural hand." She looked at me steadily. "The writ was obtained under false pretenses. I'm asking the court to dissolve it on an emergency basis before you run out of grocery money." "How long will the court take?" James asked. "If we file this morning, I'd expect a hearing by Monday or Tuesday at the latest. Emergency motions move faster than standard filings." Sandra set the paper down. "Now, Amy Vargas." James leaned forward. "I've known Amy for about 5 years. We worked together on an insurance fraud case in Arcadia. She was the notary who flagged the discrepancy that broke the case open. She's careful. She's precise. And she called me last night because she's been carrying something around for weeks, and she doesn't want to carry it anymore." "What does she know?" I asked. "Oh, she says Daniel Morton came into her office 3 times in a 6-week period," James said. "The 3rd visit, he brought documents she didn't recognize from the original file. He told her they were correction documents, routine amendments. She had concerns, but he—" James paused, choosing his word carefully. "He applied pressure. Told her it was a family matter and that raising questions would only hurt everyone involved." My back teeth pressed together so hard my jaw ached. "She's willing to talk to us?" Sandra asked. "She called me," James said. "She wants to talk." Sandra nodded slowly. "Under California Labor Code, Section 1102.12. Amy has whistleblower protection if she's reporting what she reasonably believes is a violation of law. She cannot be retaliated against for coming forward." She made a note on her legal pad. "Tonight's meeting needs to happen somewhere private. Not here, neutral ground. Somewhere she feels safe." She looked at James. "Your call on location. There's a coffee place on Marengo Avenue in Pasadena," she suggested herself, James said. "Small, quiet, she knows it." "Good." Sandra signed the bottom of the emergency motion and passed it to her assistant through the intercom. Then she looked at me. "Robert, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "All right. Is there any part of you, any part at all, that wants to call Claire today, to try to reason with her before tonight?" I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it the way you test a floorboard before you put your full weight on it. "There's a part of me that wants my daughter back," I said finally. "But I know that's not the same thing as calling her." Sandra's expression didn't soften exactly, but something behind her eyes shifted the look of someone who has heard that distinction made before and knows how much it costs a person to make it. "That's the right answer," she said quietly. We went over the rest of the strategy for another 40 minutes. Sandra walked me through the counterclaims she intended to file once we had Amy's statement in hand. Elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code Section 115-1030, forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, filing false documents under Section 115, and wire fraud under federal statute, Title 18, Section 1343, if the digital evidence supported it. Each charge had a name. Each name had a face behind it. By the time James and I walked back out onto South Flower Street, the morning sun was cutting hard and bright between the downtown buildings, the way it does in Los Angeles in April, when the air is still clean from the last rain. I stood on the sidewalk and felt it on my face and thought about 40 years of mornings that had started exactly this way. Sun up, work ahead, nothing guaranteed except the effort. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by someone you loved, if you've ever stood in the wreckage of a trust you spent decades building and tried to figure out which piece to pick up. First, I want you to type the word truth in the comments below. Because that morning, standing outside my lawyer's office with 2 frozen bank accounts and a court date pending the truth, was the only thing I had left. And I was about to find out if it was enough. James fell into step beside me as we walked toward the parking structure. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I turned my face into the sun for a moment. "Ask me again after tonight," I said. He nodded. We walked the rest of the way without needing to say anything else, the way men do when they've been friends long enough that silence between them isn't empty. It's just rest. At 6:58 that evening, we pulled into the parking lot on Marengo Avenue in Pasadena. Through this coffee shop window, I could already see a young woman sitting alone at a corner table, her back to the wall, both hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. She looked like someone who had been waiting a long time to tell the truth. Before I tell you what James found inside that file, the one piece of evidence that changed everything, drop the number 10 in the comments right now so I know you're still with me. Because what you're about to hear is the moment this entire story turned upside down. And if you've been wondering whether the truth ever actually wins, keep listening. Quick note. This story contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Some details may not reflect any specific events. If that's not your kind of content, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, the next part is worth it. The coffee shop on Marengo Avenue was the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. Mismatched chairs, handwritten menu on a chalkboard that hadn't been updated in months, the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they were telling a secret. It was exactly the right place for what we were about to do. Amy Vargas stood up when we came through the door. Not because she recognized me, but because James was with me, and the way her shoulders dropped slightly when she saw him told me she'd been holding herself rigid since she'd sat down. She was younger than I'd expected. Early 30s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back. She was wearing a gray cardigan despite the warmth of the evening, her arms crossed over her chest, like she was cold from the inside. "James," she said, and her voice had the particular thinness of someone who hasn't eaten all day. "Amy." James shook her hand and then gestured to me. "This is Robert Hayes." She looked at me for a moment. Really looked the way people do when they're trying to reconcile a story they've been told with the actual person standing in front of them. Whatever she saw, it made her uncross her arms. "Please sit down," she said. "I'll tell you everything." We ordered coffee we didn't need and sat in the corner booth with the window at our backs. Amy wrapped both hands around her cup again, still not drinking, just holding it, and took a breath that was longer and shakier than she probably intended. I've been doing notary work for 11 years, she began. In that time, I've processed maybe 4,000 documents. Deeds, trusts, loan modifications, transfer agreements. You develop a sense for when something is wrong. Not always a specific thing you can point to. Sometimes it's just a feeling like a room where the furniture has been moved 6 inches and you can't figure out why it looks different. She met my eyes. I had that feeling the third time Daniel Morton came into my office. When was the third visit? James asked. February 12th, she said without hesitation. I remember because it was the day after my mother's birthday, and I'd stayed up late on the phone with her. I was tired. He came in at 4:45 right before closing with a folder of what he called correction documents. Her jaw tightened. They didn't look like corrections. The formatting was slightly different from the original file. The font spacing was off by a fraction. The margin alignment wasn't consistent with the title company's standard template. Small things. The kind of things you only notice if you've been staring at documents for 11 years. Did you say anything to him? I asked. I asked him to explain the changes. Amy's fingers tightened around her cup. He smiled. Very calm. Very sure of himself. He said it was a routine amendment to reflect a revised contribution agreement between the parties. He said the original buyer. She paused and looked at me directly. He said the original buyer had agreed to restructure his role in the transaction, that it had all been discussed and settled. My chest tightened. He told you I'd agreed to be removed. Yes. Her voice dropped. And then he said, and I remember this exactly, because it was the moment I knew something was genuinely wrong. He said, Mr. Hayes is an older gentleman. He gets confused about paperwork sometimes. We're just trying to protect everyone involved. She stopped. Her throat moved. I've heard language like that before, Mr. Hayes. It's a very specific way of talking about someone when you're trying to make a professional doubt their own judgment. The word older landed in the room and sat there. James reached into the bag he'd brought and set his laptop on the table. Amy, when you contacted me last night, you mentioned you still had the original file in your system. No, our office keeps digital archives of everything we process for 7 years, she said. The original file from Mr. Hayes' transaction is still there, and so is the version Daniel brought in on February 12th. She reached into her bag and produced a USB drive, which she set on the table between us. I consulted my own attorney before coming tonight, she said. She confirmed I have the right to share this documentation directly given the circumstances and my whistleblower status. She set the drive down and looked at both of us. I pulled both files last night. I want you to look at something. James opened his laptop, inserted the drive, and opened the first file. Then the second. He navigated to the document properties, a screen most people never look at buried in the file information menu, and expanded the metadata panel. Here, he said, turning the laptop to face me. I leaned forward and read the screen. The original file showed a creation date of December 19th, 2024. Author listed as Pacific Coast Title Services. Last modified December 19th, 2024. Same day. Untouched after creation. The second file, the one Daniel had brought in on February 12th, showed a creation date of December 19th, 2024. The same. But the last modified entry was different. February 11th, 2025. 11:47 p.m. Device Daniel R. Morton. Location registered Pasadena, California. I stared at the screen. My vision blurred slightly at the edges and I blinked it clear. He modified the document the night before he brought it in, I said. At 11:47 at night, James said. From his own device registered in his own name. The metadata is embedded in the file itself. It's not stored on any external server. It doesn't require a subpoena to access. It's simply there in the document recording every change that was ever made and exactly when and by whom. Amy looked at me across the table. Her eyes were steady now, in a way they hadn't been when we walked in. Mr. Hayes, I should have pushed back harder in February. I should have refused to process those documents until I'd spoken to you directly. I didn't, and I have thought about that every day since. Her voice caught slightly on the last word. Daniel told me if I raised any concerns, he would report me to the California Secretary of State's office for processing documents improperly. He said it would cost me my license. The air went out of my lungs slowly. He threatened you, I said. He did. She lifted her chin. Which is why I called James. Because I'm done being threatened into silence about something I know is wrong. She pushed the USB drive slightly closer to me across the table. Everything on that drive is yours, Mr. Hayes. Do whatever you need to do with it. I reached out and picked up the drive. It was small enough to disappear in my palm. For a moment, I just held it there, this tiny thing that contained the proof that my own son-in-law had spent a night before his daughter's housewarming, falsifying legal documents while his wife was asleep upstairs. James closed the laptop. He looked at Amy. You understand that what Daniel did to you constitutes witness tampering under federal law. Title 18, Section 1512. By threatening you to prevent you from coming forward, he committed a separate crime. Amy nodded. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. I know, she said. Sandra Cole called me this afternoon. She explained my protections. She looked at me one last time. I'm sorry it took me this long, Mr. Hayes. I looked at this young woman who had carried this alone for 2 months because a man in a good suit had threatened her livelihood. And I felt something move through me that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. You're here now, I said. That's what matters. Sandra had been in her office since 6:30 that morning. I could tell because the coffee station in the corner had an empty pot and a second one already brewing, and the stack of folders on her desk had the particular organized chaos of someone who had been working through material for hours before anyone else arrived. When James and I walked in with Amy at 8:15, Sandra looked up, assessed the three of us in approximately 2 seconds, and said, "Sit down. We have a lot to do." Amy sat in the chair closest to the window. She had a different energy from Saturday night, less like someone carrying a secret, and more like someone who had already put it down and was deciding what to pick up next. She'd brought her own copy of the file documentation, printed and tabbed, which she set on the desk in front of Sandra without being asked. Sandra picked it up and paged through it in silence for about 90 seconds. Then she set it down, looked at Amy and said, "I need you to tell me exactly what Daniel Morton said to you, word for word, as close as you can remember." Amy told her. Every visit, every document, every word of the threat about her notary license. She spoke in the same careful, measured way she had the night before, the voice of someone who has rehearsed the truth until it fits precisely in their mouth. When Amy finished, Sandra turned to her legal pad. "And Amy, what Daniel did when he told you that raising concerns would cost you your license, that's not just pressure. That's a crime." Sandra set her pen down and looked at Amy directly. Under Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1512, it is a federal offense to intimidate, threaten, or corruptly persuade another person with the intent to influence their testimony or prevent them from reporting information to a law enforcement officer or in an official proceeding. She paused. The moment this case became a matter of legal investigation, which it did when Claire filed the criminal complaint against Mr. Hayes, Daniel's attempt to silence you crossed into federal witness tampering territory. Amy's chin lifted slightly. "I understand." "There's more," Sandra continued. The emails Daniel sent you after your third meeting, the ones asking you to confirm you wouldn't be raising questions about the documents those emails traveled through interstate server infrastructure. That's the mechanism that triggers Federal Wire Fraud Statute Title 18, Section 1343. The fraud itself was the scheme to deprive Mr. Hayes of his property. The emails were the wire. Both elements are present. James leaned forward. So we're not just dealing with state charges anymore. We haven't been since Amy told me about those emails Saturday afternoon, Sandra said. She picked up her pen again. I've already drafted the referral to the FBI Los Angeles field office. It goes out this morning simultaneous with our counterfiling in Superior Court. She slid a document across the desk toward Amy. This is your whistleblower declaration. It sets out everything you've told us, attests to its accuracy, and formally invokes your protections under California Labor Code, Section 1102. 5. Once you sign this, you cannot be retaliated against for coming forward. Not by Daniel Morton, not by his attorney, not by his professional contacts. If anyone attempts to interfere with your employment or your license as a result of this declaration, that interference becomes its own separate legal violation. Amy picked up the pen Sandra offered. Her hand was steady. She signed her name at the bottom of the document without reading it again. She'd clearly read it already, probably more than once, and set the pen down. Good, Sandra said. She turned to me. Robert, now I need you. She placed a thicker stack of documents in front of me. I picked up the top page. It was the counter-complaint 5 charges listed in sequence, each with its statutory citation underneath. Elder financial abuse. California Welfare and Institutions Code. Section 115.6.10.13. I read the definition Sandra had written into the filing: the taking of real or personal property of an elder for a wrongful use or with intent to defraud. Elder defined as any person 65 years of age or older. I was 67. I set the page down and picked up the next one. Forgery, California Penal Code. Section 470. Filing false documents. California Penal Code Section 115. Wire fraud. Title 18 United States Code, Section 1343. Witness tampering. Title 18 United States Code, Section 1512, 5 charges, 2 state, 3 federal. Sign at the tabs, Sandra said. I signed. Every page, every tab, every place Sandra had marked with a small yellow arrow. My signature, my real one, the one with the R that kicked out at 30 degrees, appeared 14 times across the stack of documents. When I finished, Sandra gathered everything into a single folder and handed it to her assistant through the intercom. File these simultaneously, she said. Superior Court and the federal referral go out at the same time. She turned back to the 3 of us. I want to be honest with you about where we are, she said. Filing is the easy part. What happens next depends on how Daniel responds. If he's smart, and he may be his attorney, we'll advise him to stay quiet and wait to see what the evidence looks like. If he's scared, which he should be, he may try to move money, contact Amy again, or reach out to Robert directly. She looked at me. If Daniel or Claire contacts you in any form, call, text, email, someone showing up at your door, you do not respond. You forward everything to me immediately. Understood. Understood, I said. One more thing. Sandra allowed herself a small, precise smile. The emergency motion to dissolve the writ of attachment has been accepted for hearing. Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock, Los Angeles Superior Court Department, 47. She looked at me over her reading glasses. By Tuesday afternoon, Robert, your accounts should be unfrozen. Something released in my chest that I hadn't realized was still locked. James reached over and put his hand briefly on my shoulder. One firm press, the way men of our generation expressed things that younger men might have said out loud, and then took his hand away. Amy stood to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "For what it's worth, the first time Daniel came into our office, he talked about you. He said you were a stubborn old man who didn't know when to let things go." A small, quiet look crossed her face. "I think that's the first true thing he ever said." I watched her walk out. Then I looked at the folder on Sandra's desk, the one her assistant had taken to file the one that now carried 5 charges, and 2 of those charges were federal, and all of it was moving in the direction of something I could no longer stop, even if I'd wanted to. I didn't want to. Outside Sandra's window, Los Angeles spread itself out in every direction under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Somewhere out in that city, Daniel Morton was going about his Monday morning, not yet knowing that everything had just changed. We were still in Sandra's conference room when her phone rang at 12:47. She glanced at the screen, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes that I'd learned in the past week meant she was recalibrating. She held up one finger to James, and me stood and stepped into the hallway. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see her profile. She wasn't writing anything down. She was listening mostly with the occasional short response. The call lasted 4 minutes. When she came back in, she set her phone face down on the table and looked at me. "That was Detective Reyes," she said. "She wants to meet with you this afternoon. Here, if possible. She asked if 3 o'clock worked." James straightened in his chair. "She called you." "Not Robert. She called me," Sandra confirmed. "Which means she's treating this as a legal proceeding, not an informal conversation. She wants counsel present." A pause. "That's a different posture than a detective who thinks she's still building a case against someone." I looked at the clock on the wall. 11:58. 3 hours. "What does she want?" I asked. "She said she's reviewed the counterfiling and wants to discuss some inconsistencies she's identified in the original complaint." Sandra sat back down. "In my experience, when a detective uses the word inconsistencies about the case that was filed against my client, it means she's found something that doesn't line up, and she wants to know if we can help her understand why." The 3 hours passed slowly. James went out and brought back sandwiches from a place on 6th Street that neither of us tasted. I sat at Sandra's conference table and read through the counter-complaint twice more, not because I needed to understand it better, but because having something in my hands kept them from shaking. At 2:58, Detective Reyes arrived. She looked the same as she had on my porch 8 days ago. Same practical dark jacket, same measured way of moving through a doorway. But there was something different in how she carried herself as Sandra's assistant showed her into the conference room. The first time I'd seen her, she'd had the forward momentum of someone executing a task. Today, she moved more carefully, like someone who had looked at a blueprint and realized one of the load-bearing walls was in a different place than the plans indicated. She shook Sandra's hand first, then James's, then mine. Her grip was firm and brief. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "thank you for making time." I almost said, of course, the reflexive politeness of a man raised to be agreeable, but I stopped myself. "Detective," I said instead. She sat down across from us and set a folder on the table. Not the same folder from 8 days ago. A new one, thicker. "I'll be direct," she said. "When the original complaint was filed, my office opened the investigation based on the documentation provided by the complainant. That documentation included what appeared to be a signed amendment to the property deed, along with a declaration from Claire Morton attesting to its authenticity." She opened the folder. Earlier this morning, I received a copy of your counterfiling through the DA's coordination office. I spent the weekend reviewing the materials your attorney submitted, specifically the metadata analysis of the PDF file and the forensic preliminary on the signature anomalies. She slid 2 pages across the table. These are the results of our own forensic document examination, she said. Our lab ran the signature on the amendment against samples of Mr. Hayes's known handwriting collected from his original contract documents from the title company. The analysis identified statistically significant inconsistencies in stroke pressure letter spacing and baseline angle. I picked up the page. There were side-by-side comparisons, my real signature from the original draft deed beside the signature on the amended document. Under magnification, the differences James had spotted with his reading glasses were now measured and annotated in precise decimal points. The R in Robert, the angle of the H, the pressure differential across the baseline. In plain language, Reyes continued, our examiner's preliminary conclusion is that the signature on the amended document was not produced by the same hand that signed the original. The room felt very still. Detective, Sandra said, her voice measured, are you telling us that LAPD's own forensic examination corroborates our client's position? I'm telling you what the preliminary findings show, Reyes said carefully. A final determination requires a full examination, which is underway. But yes, the preliminary findings are inconsistent with the original complaint's central allegation. She looked at me directly. Mr. Hayes, I want to ask you some questions about the timeline of the original transaction, specifically the period between December 2024 and February 2025. I need to understand the sequence of events from your perspective. So I told her. Everything in order the way I'd written it on the legal pad at 3 in the morning. The draft deed with my name on it. Daniel's promise to send the final version. The 6 weeks I'd waited. The one time I'd asked and been told it was coming. The housewarming, the kitchen window. Reyes asked precise, short questions. She didn't lead me anywhere. She just listened and made notes and occasionally asked me to clarify a date or a specific exchange. James watched her the way he used to watch witnesses in his investigation days, looking for the small tells of someone trying to construct a story versus someone trying to understand one. When I finished, Reyes closed her notebook. Mr. Hayes, she said, I want to be transparent with you. The investigation that was opened against you is not closed, but the direction of that investigation has changed. She paused. I've been in contact with the FBI field office regarding the federal elements your attorney identified. We'll be coordinating. In the meantime, I'm going to need you to remain available and continue to route all communication through Ms. Cole. Understood, I said. She stood. Sandra stood. James and I followed. At the door, Reyes turned back. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone choosing their words carefully, because the wrong ones would be unprofessional, and the right ones barely covered what needed saying. Mr. Hayes, she said, for what it's worth, in 8 years of this work, I've learned that the people who actually commit document fraud rarely come in with 4 pages of handwritten notes about the timeline. A beat. The people who do that are usually trying to remember the truth, because it's the only version they have. She left. Sandra waited until the elevator had closed before she spoke. Well, she said. Yeah, James said. I sat back down in the chair I'd been using for the past 6 hours and pressed both palms flat on the conference table and felt the solid, cool surface of it under my hands. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. I looked at the screen. Claire calling. My chest seized. I looked at Sandra. Let it ring, she said. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Then it rang again immediately. Sandra put her hand briefly over mine on the table, not quite comfort, more like an anchor. "She'll call again," Sandra said quietly. "And when she does, we'll be ready." Claire called again at 8:43 the next morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my third cup of coffee and the 4 pages I'd written 3 nights ago, reading through them for what felt like the 100th time. The court had dissolved the account freeze at 9:30 that morning. Sandra had called to confirm it, and for the first time in nearly a week, my own money was accessible again. It should have felt like a victory. It mostly felt like one less thing to worry about. Then the phone buzzed against the wood, and her name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for 2 full rings. Then I picked up. "Dad." Her voice was different from the last time we'd spoken, different from the cool, managed tone she'd used when I asked about the deed, different from the silence of unanswered calls. This was something raw, scraped thin at the edges the way a person's voice gets when they haven't slept and have stopped pretending that they have. "Claire," I said, "I need to see you." A pause. "Please, not on the phone. In person." I looked at Maggie's photograph on the side table. I thought about what Sandra had said the day before, "Don't respond forward everything to me." But Sandra had also said, "When she calls again, we'll be ready." And the truth was that somewhere underneath everything that had happened in the past 10 days, underneath the frozen accounts and the forged signatures and the detective on my porch, there was still a part of me that was simply a father. And my daughter was asking to see me. "Come to the house," I said. "This afternoon, 2 o'clock." She exhaled a long, unsteady breath that told me she'd been bracing for a no. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you, Dad." I called Sandra the moment I hung up. She listened without interrupting. "All right," she said when I finished. "Robert, you know what I'm going to tell you. Don't promise anything. Don't make any agreements. Don't discuss the legal case. And document the conversation." A pause. "California is a 2-party consent state," she said carefully. "Under Penal Code Section 632, you cannot record a conversation without informing the other party and receiving their consent. If you want to record, you have to tell Claire before the conversation begins, and she has to agree. If she doesn't agree, you don't record. And if she does agree, then whatever she says is admissible." Sandra's voice was measured. "Robert, I want to be very clear. I am not telling you to set a trap for your daughter. I'm telling you what the law requires if you choose to document the conversation. The decision is yours." I thought about it for a long moment. "I'll tell her," I said. "Whatever she decides is up to her." Claire arrived at 1:58. She came alone. I registered that immediately when I heard only one car door close in the driveway. No Daniel. She walked up the porch steps the same way she had her whole life, slightly favoring her left foot, the way she'd done since she twisted her ankle at 14 during a volleyball game. And something about that familiar, lopsided gait made my chest hurt in a way I hadn't expected. I opened the door before she knocked. She looked exhausted. There were shadows under her eyes that makeup hadn't fully covered, and she was wearing a sweatshirt. I recognized an old one from the university she'd attended, faded gray, the kind of thing people reach for when they've stopped thinking about appearances. She was clutching the strap of her bag with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Hey, Dad," she said. Her voice broke on the second word. "Come in," I said. She sat in the armchair, Maggie's armchair, the one I always used. I wasn't sure if she'd chosen it deliberately or out of habit, but she pulled her knees up slightly the way she used to as a child, making herself smaller and looked around the living room the way people do when they're trying to remember a version of a place from before everything went wrong. Her eyes landed on the two photographs on the side table. Maggie's, and the graduation picture I'd moved there 3 nights ago. She looked at that one for a long moment. I sat on the couch across from her and set my phone on the coffee table between us, face up. I said, before we talk, I want to be honest with you about something. I'd like to record this conversation. Not to use against you, I mean that, but because I'm 67 years old and I've been living in a nightmare for 10 days and I need to be able to remember clearly what was said here today without it being disputed later. I held her gaze. I'm asking your permission. You can say no. If you say no, we put the phone away and talk without it. Your choice. She looked at the phone. Then she looked at me. Something crossed her face, not calculation, not the managed composure I'd seen from her in that Sunday morning phone call. Something more like relief, like a person who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been offered a place to set it down. Okay, she said. You can record it. I reached over and opened the voice memo application. Pressed, record, set the phone back down between us. Daniel doesn't know I'm here, she said immediately, as though she'd been waiting to say it. He thinks I'm at my friend Patrice's. I didn't tell him I was coming. Her hands tightened on the bag strap in her lap. He would have told me not to. Why? I asked. Because he's scared. Her jaw tightened. He's been scared since the day you called and asked about the paperwork. That's when everything started moving. That's when he said we needed to. She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at Maggie's photograph on the side table. He said we needed to get ahead of it. I watched my daughter's face. The face I had known since the moment it came into the world, red and furious and absolutely itself. I had been so proud of that face. I had been so sure I knew everything inside it. Claire, I said carefully. Did Daniel tell you what he did to the documents? She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. Not in detail, she said. He said he made some corrections, that the original paperwork had a mistake, that it was easier to fix it than to go back through the title company. Her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I knew it wasn't right. I knew when he said it that it wasn't right. But I told myself. She stopped again. Her shoulders were shaking now just slightly the way they had at her mother's graveside, when she was trying very hard not to fall apart in public. You told yourself what? I asked. Gently. The way you ask a question you're not sure you want answered. Claire looked at her father across the coffee table, the recording app, counting seconds between them. Maggie watching from the side table, and her voice, when it finally came, was the smallest I had heard it since she was 8 years old and had come to find me in the garage to tell me she'd broken something and was sorry. I told myself you'd be okay, she said. That you had enough. That you didn't need the money the way we needed the house. A tear ran down her left cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. I told myself it wasn't really stealing because you were our family, and family takes care of each other. Her breath hitched. That's what you always taught us, Dad. Family takes care of each other. I had it backwards. I had it so backwards. My throat had closed entirely. I reached over to the end table beside the couch and picked up the envelope I'd placed there that morning. Old yellow at the edges, sealed. Maggie's handwriting on the front. Claire's name in the careful cursive her mother had used for formal things. I set it on the coffee table in front of my daughter. Your mother wrote that before she passed, I said. She asked me to give it to you when I thought the time was right. I pressed my hand flat on the table surface to keep it from shaking. I've been waiting 15 years for the right time. Claire stared at the envelope. Both hands came up from her bag strap and hovered over it without touching it, like she was afraid of what was inside, or afraid of what it would mean to open it, or both. "Dad," she whispered. "Take it," I said. "It's yours." Claire picked up the envelope with both hands. She held it the way you hold something you're not sure will survive the handling carefully, at the edges like the paper itself might dissolve if she pressed too hard. Maggie's handwriting was on the front. Claire in the careful cursive her mother had reserved for birthday cards and important letters, and the notes she used to leave in Claire's lunchbox until Claire was old enough to be embarrassed by them. She wrote this before she died. Claire's voice was barely a sound. "About 3 weeks before," I said. "She asked me to keep it until I felt the time was right." I looked at my daughter across the coffee table. "I've carried it in the same drawer for 15 years, next to my watch and the spare key to this house and the photograph from our wedding." Claire's fingers moved to the sealed edge of the envelope. She stopped. Started again. Her hands were trembling not slightly, but the deep, uncontrolled trembling of someone whose body has finally stopped pretending to be fine. "I don't know if I can," she said. "You can," I said. "Take your time." She opened it slowly. Slid out 2 pages of pale blue stationery, the kind Maggie had kept in the top drawer of her writing desk for as long as I could remember. The handwriting on the pages was slightly less steady than the cursive on the envelope the letters formed with the particular care of someone working through pain to say something that needed to be said. Claire read. I watched her face. I had imagined this moment sometimes. Over the years, wondered what Maggie had written. Wondered what Claire would look like when she finally read it. I had always pictured it as a quiet, private moment. A gift between a mother and a daughter with no one else present. This was not that. This was a living room with a recording application counting seconds on the coffee table and 10 days of wreckage between us. But Maggie had always been practical about imperfect circumstances. She would have understood. Claire's expression as she read moved through things I didn't have names for. Her brow pulled together. Her lips pressed tight. At the bottom of the first page, something happened to her face, a crumpling, an inward collapse, the look of someone who has just read a sentence they cannot unknow, and she pressed her free hand flat against her mouth. She turned to the second page. When she finished, she set the letter down on her knees. She didn't fold it. She just let it rest there, both pages open, Maggie's handwriting, facing up toward the ceiling. And then Claire cried. Not the controlled, strategic tears I had seen from her in the past 10 days. Not the kind of crying that performs grief while the mind stays busy elsewhere. This was something else entirely, the crying of someone who has just been handed the truth about themselves by the one person whose opinion they could never discount and found they had no defense against it. Her shoulders pulled forward. Her whole body shook with it. She pressed her hand harder against her mouth, as if she could hold it in, and then gave up trying and just let it happen. I got up from the couch and went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and brought it back and set it on the table in front of her. I sat back down. I didn't touch her. I didn't tell her it was okay. It wasn't okay, and she knew it, and saying otherwise would have been an insult to us both. After a while, the shaking slowed. She picked up the water and drank half of it, set it back down, wiped her face with the sleeve of the old university sweatshirt, took a long, unsteady breath. She knew, Claire said. She wrote about it. Not specifically, not this. She couldn't have known about this. But she wrote about... Claire stopped. Her voice was stripped down to something raw and fundamental. She wrote about how she was afraid I would confuse being loved with being owed. that she and Dad had maybe made it too easy, and she worried about what would happen when the world stopped making things easy. Claire looked at me with eyes so red and swollen, they barely looked like her eyes anymore. She said she hoped I'd be brave enough to deserve you. My throat had been closed for several minutes. I swallowed against it. Do you want to tell me what happened? I asked. All of it. From the beginning. She nodded. And she did. She told me Daniel had raised the idea 6 months ago, not long after I'd asked about the deed in passing during a Sunday dinner. He'd framed it first as a question, what would actually happen if your dad asked for the money back, and then as a concern, and then gradually, over weeks of small conversations, she could no longer fully separate from each other, as a plan. He said it wasn't stealing. He said I had given the money freely and had no legal claim to the property. He said the simplest thing was to make sure the paperwork reflected what was already true. She had not asked him what he meant by adjusting the paperwork. She told herself she didn't need to know the details. She was aware, as she said this, of exactly how that sounded. When the criminal complaint had been filed, she had told herself it was just a precaution, a way to protect their position. She had signed what Daniel put in front of her without reading it through. He told me it was standard, she said. Her voice had steadied into something flat and exhausted, the voice of someone giving a deposition rather than talking to their father. He said lawyers always filed these things proactively when there was a disputed asset. He said you probably wouldn't even pursue it. She looked down at the letter in her lap. He said you were old and tired and you wouldn't want the fight. The room felt very warm. He was wrong about that, I said. I know. She looked up at me. Dad, I need you to know I knew it was wrong. I'm not telling you I didn't know. I'm telling you I chose not to look at it directly because I didn't want to see what it was. Her jaw tightened. That's not an excuse. That's just what happened. I looked at my daughter's face, swollen and honest and exhausted, and felt the particular grief of a parent who has watched a child become capable of something you didn't believe they could become capable of. It wasn't anger anymore. Anger had burned through its own fuel sometime in the past 10 days and left behind something quieter, sadder, more permanent. Claire, I said, I need to ask you one direct question, and I need a direct answer. She straightened slightly. Okay. Did you know Daniel modified those documents digitally, that he took my signature from the original draft and manipulated it? She held my gaze for a long moment. The recording app counted its seconds between us. I didn't know how he did it, she said, but I knew he had done something to the paperwork. Yes. She exhaled. Yes. I knew. I nodded. Once. Slowly. All right, I said. I reached over and picked up my phone. The recording had been running for 41 minutes and 18 seconds. I looked at the screen for a moment, then set it back down without stopping it. I'm going to call Sandra now, I said. She's going to want to talk to you. Probably today. I looked at my daughter. Claire, you should call your own attorney before that conversation. Someone who represents you, not Daniel. Someone who can tell you what your options are. Her eyes widened slightly, not at the suggestion itself, but at what the suggestion implied. At the shape of what was coming. Are you going to use the recording? She asked. I'm going to give it to Sandra, I said. What she does with it is her decision to make. I paused. But Claire, you agreed to be recorded. You knew. And you told the truth anyway. I let that sit for a moment. That matters. It will matter to the people who decide what happens next. She picked up the letter from her lap and folded it carefully along its original creases, slid it back into the pale yellow envelope, held it in both hands. "Can I keep this?" she asked. "It was always yours," I said. She stood up. At their door, she turned back the same way she had at every door her whole life, always one last thing, always one more moment before she could make herself leave. "Dad," she said. Her voice had come back to something close to itself. Not all the way, but close. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I am." I looked at my daughter standing in the doorway of the house she had grown up in, holding her mother's letter. And I thought about 40 years of mornings and Sunday dinners and volleyball games and late-night phone calls about leaking faucets and the way she had reached for my hand at the graveside without looking because she knew I would be there. "I know you are," I said. "Go call a lawyer, Claire. Take care of yourself." She left. The door closed behind her. I sat back down in the armchair. Her armchair, Maggie's armchair, the one that had held more of this family's weight than any piece of furniture had a right to, and I picked up my phone and called Sandra. She answered on the first ring. "How did it go?" she asked. I looked at the recording. 46 minutes and 32 seconds. She told me everything I said. And she agreed to be recorded before she did. A silence on Sandra's end that was not quite silence. The sound of a person recalibrating the way she had when she'd looked at Claire's text message about my name on the deed and said they made a mistake keeping that. "Robert," she said finally, and her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. "Send me the file." I slept that night. Not long, maybe 5 hours, but it was real sleep, the kind that actually rests you. And when I woke at 5:45 on Wednesday morning, the first thing I felt was not dread, but something closer to readiness. The particular stillness of a man who has done everything he can do to prepare, and now has only the day itself left to get through. I showered, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window while the sky over Glendale went from black to gray to the pale, clear blue that only happens in Los Angeles in April after a rain. Then I went to the bedroom and opened the closet. In the back behind the shirts I wore to job sites and the flannel I wore around the house, there was a dark navy suit I'd bought for Maggie's funeral and worn twice, since once for her sister's retirement dinner, once for a Union Hall ceremony, where a colleague of 30 years had been given a service award. I took it out and laid it on the bed. The tie had been Maggie's choice. Burgundy with a small geometric pattern she'd described as distinguished. I told her it made me look like I was trying too hard. She told me trying hard was underrated. I stood at the bathroom mirror and put it on. It took me 3 attempts to get the knot right. My hands weren't shaking, that surprised me. After 11 days of hands that wouldn't stay still, they were steady this morning. I pulled the knot up to my collar and looked at my reflection. Behind me on the dresser was Maggie's photograph. I'd moved it there from the living room the night before because I'd wanted her close to where I slept. I turned around and looked at it directly. "I know you'd have something to say about all of this," I told her. "You'd probably tell me I should have called a lawyer 2 years ago when Daniel stopped returning my calls about the paperwork. You'd be right." I straightened the knot once more. But here we are. I picked up my coffee, looked at the suit in the mirror one more time. 40 years of work clothes, steel-toed boots, canvas pants, safety vests in high-visibility orange. Today I was wearing a dead woman's favorite tie to a conference room where the man who had forged my name would be sitting across a table from me. I thought about everyone who had gotten me to this morning. James, who had driven across the city the moment I called and had not once suggested I might be wrong. Sandra, who had turned 11 days of chaos into 5 specific charges and a court date. Amy Vargas, who had carried a secret for 2 months because a man in a good suit had threatened her livelihood and then decided her conscience was worth more than her fear. Detective Reyes, who had looked at the evidence and followed it wherever it went, even when it went in a different direction than where she'd started. And Claire, who had opened a letter she was afraid to read and told the truth she was afraid to tell. If you've ever been pushed to the edge of everything you built and found out you were still standing, if you've ever discovered that the people trying to bury you handed you the shovel they used as evidence, I want you to type the word justice in the comments. Because that morning, I walked out of the only home I'd known for 40 years, not as a man who had been accused of something he didn't do. I walked out as a man who had spent 11 days proving exactly who he was. James was already waiting in the driveway when I came out at 7:55. He looked at the suit, looked at the tie, looked at my face. "Ready?" he said. I locked the front door behind me, dropped the key in my pocket, turned toward the car. "Let's go," I said. "Before I walk you into that conference room, before Daniel sits down across from me and everything finally comes out in the open, I need to know you're still here." Type the word justice in the comments. One word. That's all. Because what happens in the next few minutes took me 67 years, 40 years of work, and 11 of the hardest days of my life to get to. One quick note before we continue: parts of this story include fictional elements added to bring the experience to life. It may not reflect any particular true events, and if that's not the kind of content you're looking for, you're welcome to step away at any time. No judgment. But if you're staying, hold on tight. Daniel arrived at 9:03 with his attorney. He was dressed better than I'd ever seen him: charcoal suit, silk tie, the careful presentation of a man who had decided that confidence was a costume he could put on. He walked into Sandra's conference room without looking at me directly, which told me everything I needed to know about how well that costume was fitting. His attorney was a tall man named Greer, who set his briefcase on the table with the deliberate thud of someone establishing territory. Detective Reyes was already in the corner chair, notebook open, pen uncapped. Sandra let everyone settle. Then she opened the folder in front of her. "Thank you all for being here," she said, in the tone of someone who is not actually thanking anyone. "We'll move through this efficiently." She slid the first document across the table. Wire transfer records. $280,000 originating from Robert Hayes's retirement account, deposited into the Morton joint account on December 22, 2024. The source of funds for the Pasadena property purchase. Greer glanced at it. "We don't dispute the transfer." "Good." Sandra slid the second document across. Text message from Claire Morton to Robert Hayes, sent November 3, 2024. Quote, "Your name will be on there, I promise." She paused. This establishes that Mr. Hayes was not making a gift. He was making a contribution under the expectation of ownership. That's the foundation of our constructive trust claim. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was looking at the table. James opened his laptop and turned it to face the room. Metadata from the amended deed document provided by the notary office under whistleblower protection. His voice was even unhurried, the voice of a man who has explained things to skeptical people for 30 years. The file was last modified on February 11, 2025 at 11:47 p.m. The device listed in the modification log is a MacBook Pro registered to Daniel R. Morton, Pasadena, California. Greer started to speak. Sandra held up one hand. Mr. Greer, we're not finished." She reached into the folder and produced the recording release form Claire had signed the previous afternoon, with a copy of the audio file log beside it. Yesterday, Claire Morton met with Mr. Hayes voluntarily. She was informed that the conversation would be recorded. She consented in writing. The recording is 46 minutes and 32 seconds. Sandra looked at Claire directly. Mrs. Morton, you understand that we'll be referencing portions of that recording today. Claire, sitting at the far end of the table with her own attorney beside her, a woman named Delaney she had called the previous evening, gave a single nod. She had not looked at Daniel once since walking in. Sandra pressed play. Claire's voice filled the room. He said he made some corrections, that the original paperwork had a mistake. And then 60 seconds later, the question and the answer that mattered. Did you know Daniel modified those documents digitally? A pause. I didn't know how he did it, but I knew he had done something to the paperwork. Yes, I knew. Sandra stopped the recording. The room was very quiet in the way that rooms get when something that cannot be unsaid has just been said. Daniel looked at Claire. Something moved across his face, not the polished composure he'd walked in with, but something underneath it, cracked now and showing through. Claire was looking at her hands folded on the table in front of her. Then James reached into the bag beside his chair and set the wooden picture frame on the table. No explanation, no introduction, just the frame, dark walnut, hand-sanded with the photograph inside of Claire at 8 years old in a hard hat, standing between her parents at a job site, grinning like the world had been built for her. Greer looked at it, looked at James. What is this? Something Mr. Hayes brought to his daughter's housewarming, James said. He left it on the porch when he decided not to go inside. Nobody responded. Nobody needed to. Greer leaned toward Daniel and spoke quietly. Daniel shook his head once, a tight, controlled movement. Then Greer sat back and looked at Sandra. My client would like a recess, he said. Of course, Sandra said. Detective Reyes, did you have anything before we break? Reyes stood. She looked at Daniel with the neutral professional expression of someone who has made a decision and is now implementing it. Mr. Morton, she said, when we reconvene, I'll need you to come with me. Daniel looked at his attorney. Greer gave the smallest nod. Daniel looked at Claire one final time. She was still looking at her hands. I turned toward the window. 12 floors below Los Angeles went about its Wednesday morning traffic and pedestrians, and the particular indifferent momentum of a city that has seen everything and forgotten most of it. Somewhere down there, in all that motion, was the rest of my life. I was ready to go find it. 2 months passed. The way recovery passes, not quickly, not cleanly, but with a direction to it that earlier months had not had. Sandra called me on a Wednesday morning in mid-June and asked if I could come in. I drove downtown in the same truck that had broken down on the way to the housewarming, which I'd finally had properly serviced at a shop on San Fernando Road, and I parked in the same structure on Flower Street, and I rode the same elevator to the 12th floor. The folder on Sandra's desk was thinner than the ones I'd grown used to seeing. It's done, she said. She walked me through it methodically the way she did everything. Daniel had entered a plea agreement with the federal prosecutor's office 3 weeks earlier. In exchange for a guilty plea on forgery under California Penal Code Section 470 and wire fraud under Title 18 Section 1343, the remaining charges were dropped. The agreement required cooperation with the ongoing investigation and a full accounting of the document modification process. His sentence, a suspended prison term with 5 years of federal supervised probation to follow. A $50,000 fine payable to the federal court. Mandatory surrender of his California architect's license for 5 years. He won't be designing anything for a while, Sandra said. And Claire? I asked. Sandra set down her pen. Claire cooperated fully from the day after your meeting. Her own attorney negotiated a separate agreement. She received a 1-year suspended sentence, 18 months of mandatory counseling, and 200 hours of community service. She looked at me over her reading glasses. The DA took her cooperation into account, and the recording. I nodded. The civil matter. Sandra continued picking up the last document in the folder. Under California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15657, the court has ordered full restitution of your contribution to the property purchase, $280,000 to be paid from the proceeds of the Pasadena property sale. She slid the page across the desk. Additionally, under the same statute, Daniel and Claire are responsible for all attorney's fees incurred in this matter. I looked at the figure at the bottom of the page. $280,000. Every cent I had pulled from 40 years of saving and handed across a kitchen table because I loved my daughter and wanted her to have something solid to stand on. Coming back. Sandra, I said, what do I owe you? She smiled, the small, precise smile I'd come to recognize as her version of genuine warmth. Not a dollar, Robert. Daniel Morton is paying my bill, in full. I looked at the document for a long moment. Then I signed where she indicated, and she countersigned, and her assistant collected the folder. And that was that. 11 days of the worst thing that had ever happened to me, reduced finally to a signature on a thin stack of papers on a Wednesday morning in June. Outside on Flower Street, the summer heat was already building the kind of dry, pressing warmth that settles over Los Angeles in June, like a hand laid flat on your shoulder. I stood on the sidewalk and let it sit there. My phone buzzed. James. Well, he said when I answered. It's done, I said. Good. A pause. You okay? I thought about it honestly. Getting there, I said. That's enough, James said. That's plenty. I put the phone in my pocket and stood on South Flower Street in downtown Los Angeles in my regular clothes. Not the suit, not the work gear, just jeans and a clean shirt, and felt the particular quiet weight of a thing that was finally finished. Then I looked at my phone one more time. There was a message from Claire. Sent the previous night at 11:47, the same time I noticed that Daniel had modified the document that had started all of this. I didn't know if she'd noticed that. Probably not. The message said, Dad, I know you don't have to, but if you're ever willing to talk, I'll be here, whenever you're ready. No pressure. I read it twice. Put the phone back in my pocket. Not yet. But maybe. Someday. When the ground felt solid enough, I walked to my truck and drove home through the summer streets of Los Angeles. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't have anywhere I needed to be, except wherever I decided to go next. The house in Santa Monica was small enough that I could hear the ocean from the kitchen. Not see it. I'd have needed another 2 blocks and a rooftop for that, but hear it. A low, steady presence behind everything, like a sound the world made when it was breathing normally. I stood in the empty living room on the first morning with a mug of coffee and just listened to it for a while. I'd bought the place 6 weeks after the judgment came through. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a back porch that caught the afternoon light in a way that made me think of Maggie every time I stood on it. The previous owners had left a lemon tree in the yard that apparently produced more lemons than one household could reasonably use. I took that as a good sign. James helped me move in on a Saturday. We made 3 trips in my truck and were done by noon, which is the advantage of not owning much. Afterward, we sat on the back porch with sandwiches and cold beer, and he didn't ask me how I was doing, and I didn't tell him, and it was one of the best afternoons I'd had in years. The first thing I unpacked was Maggie's photograph. I put it on the windowsill in the kitchen where it would catch the morning light. The second thing was the picture frame. Dark walnut, hand-sanded. Claire at 8 years old in a hard hat grinning. I put it beside Maggie's photograph. I stood there looking at both of them for a long moment. Then I went to the bedroom and opened the top drawer of the dresser I'd carried from Glendale, the same drawer that had held my watch and the spare house key and the wedding photograph for 15 years. I reached to the back and took out the pale yellow envelope. I carried it to the back porch, sat down in the chair that faced the yard and the lemon tree, and the October sky going gold at the edges. Made myself comfortable the way you do when you intend to take your time, and I opened it. Maggie's handwriting on pale blue stationery. 2 pages. I read every word slowly the way the letter deserved to be read, and when I finished, I sat with it in my lap and looked at the lemon tree for a long while. She had known. Not the specifics she couldn't have, but she had known the shape of what might come the way she had always known things about people before they knew themselves. She had written about love without conditions and strength without bitterness, and the particular kind of courage it takes to keep your heart open after it's been broken by someone you raised. She had written, "Robert, you were always the strongest person in any room. You just never believed it, because you were too busy holding everyone else up." I folded the letter carefully along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, held it against my chest with one hand. "I believe it now, Maggie," I said. The ocean kept breathing. The lemon tree held its fruit. The October light moved slowly across the yard, the way it does when a day has nowhere urgent to be. I finished my coffee. Then I went inside to start unpacking the rest of my life. 40 years of building things taught me one truth I keep coming back to: family stories. Revenge doesn't look like what you see in the movies. It doesn't look like rage or retaliation. It looks like a man in his late 60s sitting on a back porch in Santa Monica, finally understanding where his boundaries should have been all along. Don't wait until someone takes everything before you ask the hard questions. Don't confuse sacrifice with love. And don't let family drama revenge teach you lessons that a simple, honest conversation could have handled years earlier. I'm not a perfect man. I held on too long, trusted too blindly, and gave too much without asking anything in return. God gave me the strength to stand back up when it mattered most, and I believe He put the right people in my path for a reason. My personal opinion: the most powerful family story's revenge isn't the kind that destroys. It's the kind that rebuilds you. These family drama revenge moments don't announce themselves. They build quietly, one unanswered question at a time. And the family story's revenge that matters most isn't found in a courtroom. It's found in the morning you wake up and realize you chose yourself. And when they arrive, they rarely look the way you imagined. Every family drama revenge story I've ever known started with someone who gave too much and asked too little. If this story moved, you leave a comment, tell me what you'd have done differently. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe truth still wins, subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements constructed for educational and entertainment purposes. If this content isn't for you, we completely respect that. Feel free to explore other content that better suits your taste.